if you feel like you're getting closer to retiring this next year, you're getting closer in terms of your savings, in terms of your mindset, but you're not really sure how to make it happen, I'm going to walk you through how I'm mapping out this big decision using a real case study. We'll tackle some of the hidden risks and opportunities so you can start building a realistic retirement plan for yourself. And I think this next year is going to be a big year for many people I've talked with. Lots of really excited to retire. And the last thing I want you to do is really start to delay your dreams and regret not having a clear plan. So let's go ahead and dig right in. So let's meet Jeff and Susie, not real names of course, but let's peek inside their retirement plan and all the questions and concerns they had before they started having a plan for retirement. Because once you can get over some of these hurdles, you can really start to have a lot more confidence in making this actual decision. Now, Jeff and Susie had done pretty well for themselves, saving nearly $3 million, but they still had the same concerns as someone with $500,000 or even $8 million. Now, Jeff is age 60. He's been working in the corporate world for over 30 years. He's worked really hard and he really likes the people that he's been working with, but the company at this point is just not the same as it used to be. And even though he has a pretty high up position, he's ready to step away. Susie is also 59, but she stepped away from the workforce a few years ago and has focused her time with her grandkids. When they came to us, here are some of their top priorities and concerns that we started to have to work through. Number one, in terms of financial planning, right? Creating a spending plan for them to live comfortably off their investments, but they still want to give charitably in retirement. That's something that was really important to them. They wanted to give around $1,000 per month. And yes, a lot of our clients still give even after they retire. Like a lot of people that do start working with us, they had worked with an advisor for many years. They were able to save a good nest egg, but now they wanted to get some clarity on how to actually create an organized strategy for retirement income and how they make their money last, right, for the next 40 years. So here are also some of their top concerns and worries, things that were kind of preventing them from retiring. Number one is not getting killed in taxes. How do they withdraw their money given they have a significant amount of money in those tax deferred accounts, and they're concerned about future RMDs, required minimum distributions. Secondly, they've had health concerns in their family before, so they want to make sure that they are well prepared for any sort of long-term care spending later on in life. And then thirdly, their concern was, how do we prepare for a potential bear market? Now, 2025, the stock market is all-time high. And so one of their concerns is, hey, we're about to retire. What if the stock market drops? How do they make sure we don't overspend and spend down their portfolio too soon? And writing down some of your biggest concerns, I believe, is a really important part to this retirement process because, and I'm not trying to be all woo-woo here, but there's a lot of value in listing these things out so you can be better prepared for how to address them head on. And for Jeff and Susie, their concerns were identified, right? Taxes, healthcare, market volatility, and now we know where to focus, what areas we need to focus in to start to reduce that uncertainty and give them peace of mind. But let's look at their assets. They had been saving for years leading up to retirement in tax deferred accounts. They have about $2.5 million in those tax deferred accounts and about $400,000 or so in a taxable brokerage account, which will be key when we talk about their withdrawal strategy later. And of course, they did have a good buffer of savings just in cash for those immediate emergency funds as they head into retirement. Their home here was about $1.2 million here in San Diego. And in case you're wondering, that's a fairly nice but modest home here in this part of the country. And then in terms of liabilities, they still do have a small mortgage, really not that significant, very small, that they're going to pay off in a few years, around $80,000 left. So if you're someone that is wanting to retire this next year, I would say the first step is to start listing out your balance sheet, your income sources. And I think most people obviously have a rough idea, but very few have it all in one place written down. And I think it's a really valuable second step before you plan to retire. And this will also segue perfectly into our next step, which is how do we know how much they can spend? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what they can spend, right? What we think they can spend in terms of what their portfolio will allow, what they want to spend, and how do we address that? And it's not enough to simply say you have enough money. We have to build a framework for smart decisions well into the future for the next 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 even years for some people, right? So let's take a quick look at a retirement income optimizer, and we'll start at the bottom of my screen here. Now, Jeff and Susie let us know the absolute essential amount they would realistically want to spend if they had to spend a minimum amount would be about $8,800 per month. They will also want to spend about $9,800 per month. That's kind of their desired spending in order to retire comfortably. And initially, at least with their current picture, we're projecting they can actually spend around $13,000 per month, but there's more on that later because we need to talk about how we're going to actually factor in some of these other scenarios. But this is how their expenses break down. About $8,000 per month is just their baseline expenses to enjoy their retirement. In terms of their variable expenses, they still want to give to charity. And then they also still have that very small mortgage principal and interest payment each month and a little bit of tax here, which you would see that's kind of low, right? Why are they paying so little tax early on with this current strategy? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in terms of our withdrawal strategy. But now this is going to leave an extra $40,000 of surplus income potential in this year. Now this analyzer is going to show you what you can spend and you can compare it to actually what you want to spend. But again, we're not quite done yet because we also need to factor in how much can we spend while still allowing a buffer for long-term care. So there are a number of different ways you can plan for long-term care using some a little bit more advanced concepts. There's long-term care insurance, which right now is pretty costly. There's home equity, which most people tend to use if they don't care to leave a home to their children. And then finally, there's factoring it into your withdrawal strategy or your retirement spending, which is another way to say self-insurance. Now, there's a Genworth cost of care tool that can really help you calculate what that cost of care might look like in your area. And I don't want to get to the details in that video, but ultimately we decided to use what we call the false floor method. Instead of the goal of ending your plan with $0, we actually use a non-zero asset value. This is something that can be used for leaving money to others or something for long-term care. For them, they wanted to leave an inflation-adjusted balance at the end of their life of about $450,000 or so, adjusted for inflation. You can kind of picture this like a fighter pilot, right? Fighter pilots create a buffer when they fly down saying, hey, this is the minimum floor where we technically would still be safe here, but they want to make sure we have a good buffer in terms of what you actually can spend. By doing this, you can create more of a buffer at the end of life for things like long-term care. So let's look at the impact of adding this buffer at the end of life, this false floor. And the impact is going to be simply reducing what they can spend on a monthly basis. We were originally at $13,200. Now we've dropped by about $400 per month. Now that may seem small and insignificant, but that is spending over $140,000 less over a 30-year plus retirement period. That small adjustment to spending is going to compound for many, many years. So that's why it creates that buffer at the end of life. But we're still not quite done yet because sometimes you want to go out of the plan and spend money on a car or a big trip, or there's a big unexpected expense that comes up in retirement. Because of this, what we do is we create a slush fund. And for them, we create a slush fund about every 5 years that they're free to spend, right? They're free to spend that amount during that time period. They don't have to spend it, but they have the opportunity to spend it during those periods of time. And what this does is give an extra dose of freedom and reality to the plan. And what it's going to do is it's going to adjust what they actually can spend downward further. And now you can see this adjusts their monthly spending to pretty significantly downward because we're spending that every 5 years, right? And this is still a good picture because there's a buffer between what they actually want to spend and what the software is analyzing that they can spend. And you can see that after factoring in all these three items, long-term care, a slush fund, and their overall spending capacity, they still have that surplus they could potentially spend each year. And that adds an extra level of confidence, knowing that they have room in their budget if they needed it. And even if they aren't spending their full allowance, we use our risk-based guardrails to determine if they can give themselves a raise if the portfolio starts to grow above $3.8 million. And if a major downturn comes about, this case, if the portfolio drops to about $1.5 million, they know that there's a line in the sand for when to tighten the belt, And this will also factor in, how we set up the investment portfolio, how much to put towards growth and how much to put towards conservative investments to protect against the downside. And this is separate from cash in the bank, of course. But the reality is that Jeff and Susie have been flexible their whole life, and they know that having a plan that tells them when they should start reducing their spending will give them a lot more confidence knowing that they're on track and they can really consider retiring this next year. But let's take this a step further. We need to address what their current tax picture looks like. And the good news for them is that they do have that taxable approach account to begin their retirement spending, which will help with our tax strategy. And I'll kind of explain why. But as it stands, if we take a 10,000 foot view of their finances, if they withdraw income from that brokerage account first, taxes are very minimal in those early years. They have what we call the retirement tax valley. And it's common for a lot of retirees that retire before Social Security. Because of this, there's a low period of taxes because of the favorability of tax treatment of capital gains. But we need to ask ourselves the question, can we take advantage of some of these lower tax bracket years now in order to pay less taxes later and lower taxes over a lifetime? Because taxes, unfortunately, with a 401k or an IRA are not optional. But what is in more of our control is when you pay the tax and at what tax rate. And based on their situation, it turns out we can take advantage of this. Because if we continue with mechanically withdrawing from the tax approach account, then the tax-deferred account, and then tax-free Roth in terms of the sequence, the math shows that they would be overpaying in terms of total taxes of about $2.2 million because these RMDs are going to drive up their tax rate because these forced distributions. And these calculations are not even factoring that we're currently in a lower tax rate environment. This is just assuming that tax rates stay the same. And given these high levels of debt in the country, I'm not a betting man, but we don't just want to assume taxes change, of course. This could very much change the math more in favor of Roth conversions. But as things stand, at least directionally, it seems to make sense that we start looking at Roth conversions for them. And if we go back to these tax payments here, we can see that this is if they convert it and fill up to the 22% tax bracket. Now each yellow bar here is the taxes we paid earlier on versus the blue bars if we just kind of kick the can down the road. That means paying tax a little bit more in the beginning of retirement. And because they're retired early, they're in that tax valley. And that does mean potentially higher health insurance costs. But another question we need to ask ourselves, if we convert a little bit less and reduce the impact of RMDs just slightly, maybe a little bit less Roth conversions, a little bit less of an impact on your health insurance costs, can we still reap the benefits? And in their case, the answer is, at least directionally, they're still projected to save pretty significantly when it comes to taxes. But there's a second factor to think about here that not a lot of people think about when it comes to required minimum distributions starting at age 73. The value of their accounts are expected to be about $3 million in tax deferred at that point at RMD age. That means a good chunk of that mandatory taxable income is going to be there even though they don't necessarily need it. So even though Roth conversions help minimize that forced taxable income, we need to still find the sweet spot, right? If we overdo it and we pay too much taxes up front, you're going to have a lot more minimal of a benefit. And one of their desires that was really key for me to understand was they wanted to continue to give to charity over their lifetime. And let me show you why tax planning is a long game. And that's because at that age, we can actually give directly from their IRA. Once they get past age 70 and a half, these are called qualified charitable distributions or QCDs, and these gifts directly from your IRA can satisfy those required minimum distributions. So we don't want to over convert for that exact reason. And of course, there's a lot more that goes into the decision of converting to Roth, and I can't get into all the details of that, which I've made videos, so go check those out after this. But it all comes down to planning for the long game, and I think way too many people are focused on the short term, on that now, and looking at the deductions, and they get tunnel vision that they lose sight of the bigger picture. But to accomplish this retirement, especially for those looking at retiring next year, none of this really matters if you're invested poorly. What Jeff and Susie realize, as they should, is good times and bad times both come and go, especially when it comes to the economy, especially when it comes to investment markets. For them, they had a lot of old mutual funds that were okay, but they had these high expenses underlying in the funds. And frankly, there wasn't really a plan for asset allocation. Now, a lot of people just mistakenly will take their age, they'll take their risk preference and determine an asset allocation for retirement. They just slap like a 60-40 on it. Now, age and risk tolerance are an important consideration, but you would still be missing a key piece. So here's what we helped Jeff and Susie see. Now, we started by going back to our spending, specifically how much they would be spending and withdrawing from their portfolio in the first 5 years. Now, when I'm building a portfolio, I want to build it in a way that can weather these downturns in retirement. When you're working, downturns are good. You're buying stocks at a discount, you're buying more securities. But for them, we wanted to say, hey, how long do you think a bear market will last? And they said, I don't know, maybe 10 years. Now, bear markets average 3 years from peak to peak, and some have lasted longer than 5 years. But for them, they started to feel comfortable about having about 5 years of conservative investments set aside as their retirement emergency fund, essentially. So in the first year, they take out around $163,000, right? That's assuming they're doing Roth conversions, and we're also paying the Roth conversion taxes. That's the equivalent of around $163,000 in withdrawals, starting with their brokerage account, and then doing about $123,000 Roth conversion, and doing that, of course, over multiple years. And that'd be at approximately $34,000 on the tax bill. So after dividends, interests, fees, that means they need about $115,000 worth of principal that they would need to sell to fund that first year. Again, assuming the portfolio didn't grow, that's just under a 4% withdrawal rate for those of you wondering. And the instrument for funding this would be those short-term bonds and cash, so we don't have to sell from stocks while the market is dropping. So that 5 years of cash flow needed is about $850,000. And if we look at it from the portfolio standpoint, that's about 30% of the entire portfolio. And the rest, that 70% or so that we're not going to touch till later, could be invested for the long term. Now, preferably, I would want most of the conservative investments in the tax account because that is where we are going to draw from first. And the growth assets can be more so in those pre-tax accounts and Roth accounts because we're not going to touch that money for a longer time. Now, there's a quick side note that I need to address here, and I often get this question about that taxable account. And people come to me and they have a taxable account that's full growth. And when I'm funding retirement with this, I don't want to sell from stocks when the market is dropping. So what can you do when you start to lead up to retirement, starting to have a little bit more conservative investments in that account, depending on your situation? If you have stocks in that account, you need to understand how much risk you want to have in that account. But in the meantime, if you're taking income from that account and the stock market is dropping and you don't yet have those conservative investments, you can play a little game of tax arbitrage, basically where you're selling those stocks in the brokerage account for a loss, for income, while having conservative investments in those pre-tax accounts. And what you do is you sell it in the pre-tax account, sell those conservative investments, buy the same amount of stock that you've sold in the taxable account, and you're playing a little bit of a game of tax arbitrage while keeping the same asset allocation, right? And you don't generate taxes from pulling from the retirement account. But let's back up here, because at the end of the day, the goal here when a bear market comes along is how long can we take from those income from those stable investments so we can allow stocks to recover and not have to sell them when they're down 30-40%. And by doing this, by understanding how much income you need for those first years, you can start to put together an overall asset allocation plan that matches your actual life. So after we put all this together and we run a plan through thousands of different simulations based on what they want to spend, overall, because we're flexible and we're using this guardrail approach, 99% of the scenarios would end up in a position of spending more, at least through this scenario. And in terms of income adjustments, right, about every 2 years, they could expect to experience about an average increase. And in the simulation, about every 9 years, they could expect a decrease. Now, this is where running these type of stress tests can really test your plan and understand if your spending is in line and if you may need to make any sort of adjustments, like working a little bit longer or spending a little bit less. But we know for them that they are in a very good position to retire in the following year. So I hope those of you that are watching and you're heading into this next year and you're thinking about retirement, number one, you've written down what your goals, what your priorities are, what are your top concerns, right? Writing those out is really important. Number two, not just knowing your financial picture in your head, but you've actually written it out. You actually have a balance sheet in terms of your assets, liabilities, also your income sources. And number three, you have a reasonable understanding of how much you can spend and you are willing to be flexible with your spending in retirement. Next, you have the ability to stress test your plan and start thinking about what those what-if scenarios are going to be. And then finally, you start to put together a retirement tax strategy for yourself. But I didn't have time to go through the details of actually how we think about allocating a portfolio to accomplish this. So I previously posted a full video where I go into the details on how I'd allocate a $3 million portfolio for retirement. You should definitely watch that by clicking right here. Once again, this is Matt Calcagno, certified financial planner and advisor at 1 Degree Advisors. If you'd like to talk to me or someone on my team about your financial plan, click the link in the description below, and we would love to learn a little bit more about you.